A solvency ratio is meant to measure a company's debt level. They compare the debt levels with equity, assets, and earnings. They show a company's ability to make payments and pay off its long-term obligations to its creditors. Better solvency ratios indicate that they are financially stable and worthy of issuing credit. There are many types of solvency ratios, but the most common are debt ratio, equity ratio, and debt to equity ratio. The debt ratio measures a company's total debts or liabilities as a percentage of its total assets. The ratio measures the financial leverage of a company. It shows how many assets the company would have to sell to pay off its debts. A debt ratio is simply a company's total liabilities divided by its total assets. For example, if Company A has $10 million of debt on its balance sheet and $15 million of assets, then Company A's debt ratio is figured $10 million divided by $15 million, or 0.67%, which would convert to 67%. A lower debt ratio usually implies a more stable business because a lower ratio means lower overall debt. A debt ratio of 0.5 is usually considered a reasonable ratio and is usually considered less risky. So Company A would be considered a risky venture and would probably have a hard time getting credit. An equity ratio measures the amount of assets that are financed by investments. It compares the total equity in a company to its total assets. This ratio highlights two important financial concepts of a sustainable business. It shows how much of the company's total assets are owned outright by the investors. The inverse shows how much are leveraged with debt. Equity ratio is company's total equity divided by total assets. For example, if Company B equity ratio is figured 8 million divided by 10 million, that would be 0.8 or 80%. In general, higher equity ratios are typically more favorable. So Company's B equity ratio of 0.8 means they own 80% of their assets and only 20% is leveraged with debt. This means Company B would be considered more sustainable and less risky to lend future loans. A debt to equity ratio compares a company's total debt to total equity. This ratio shows the percentage of company financing that comes from creditors and investors. Debt to equity is a company's total debt or liabilities divided by the total equity. For example, if Company C had $10 million in debt on its balance sheet and $25 million in equity, then its debt to equity ratio is figured $10 million divided by $25 million, or 0.4, which would be 40%. A lower debt to equity ratio usually shows a more financially stable business. So Company C with 0.4 debt to equity ratio, or 40%, would not be considered risky and shouldn't have a problem with the lenders. Solvency ratios are extremely useful in helping analyze a firm's ability to meet its long-term obligations. But like most financial ratios, they shouldn't be used alone. They should be used with a company's overall financial profile. Investors need to consider how fast the company is growing and whether it is well run overall before it makes its decision on lending.